Welcome to this tutorial. This tutorial shows you how to make an enemy that can move side to side, and as it rebounds off an invisible object it then turns the other direction. And so you might have seen something like this in the games like Super Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog, where the little turtle moves to the left a couple of meters and then switches to the right, and the object of the game is to get past it without getting touched by it, because then it kills you. So what I've done is I've made up two sprites. One is a grey block, which is pretty much just very plain. Clicked on the center, clicked OK, and the next one is like an arrow. Now this arrow is going to be our enemy that's going to move from side to side. So what we need to do is obviously make ourselves a new object, and this new object needs to be based on our sprite enemy. And so we can just write object underscore enemy, and we need to have a create event in which this enemy is obviously going to have movement. You can do it any direction you want, but for the point of this we're just going to set it with some horizontal speed. We're going to set it with a horizontal speed of 3, applying to the self and clicking OK. Now the next thing we do is we set up a collision with our other grey sprite. So we need to make an object, a new object for our grey sprite, which is just sprite block, and we can just call it object underscore block. And the key here is that usually our objects are visible and solid, but we turn them off visible so that it's like an invisible object that we're going to be placing in our room. Now you'll be able to see it in your room in the GameMaker program, but not when we actually play the room. So I've got an orange room, and I'm going to be able to place my block like so, and I can place another block in line with it. So we've got two grey blocks, and even though you can see them there, you'll see as we play the game we haven't ticked them as visible, so those two grey blocks are actually invisible. So now we open up our object enemy, and we've given it a horizontal speed. So what we need to do now is this one here, reverse horizontal direction. We need to set a collision up with our block. So when our enemy moves along, he hits the block, we want him to reverse his horizontal direction so that he goes back. Then what happens when he collides with the block on the other side? He then turns around again and heads towards the other block. And so we click OK. Now what we need to do is go into our room and enter our enemy. So you left click, we've got our object enemy, and we click him into our room. All we have to do then is we press play, and we'll see our enemy move from side to side and bounce between these two invisible grey markers. So you can see that works. Now there's one more thing we can do to make our game look more realistic. Now as it bounces, it stays the same direction. It would look slightly cooler if we can flip it over so when it hits the block on this side, the arrow or the enemy then faces the other direction. So it's very simple, but we can do that now. What we need to do is we duplicate our sprite, so our sprite that's our enemy, and we're just going to change it to our sprite enemy left, so we know that that's when it turns to the left. Now we need to flip this over. We go to edit sprite, and we go to transform, and we flip it or mirror it horizontal. Now when we tick, we can see we've got two, one that faces the right and one faces the left. We then open up our object enemy, and we need to tell it to change it into this other sprite every time it collides with the grey block. So the way we do this is we need to set up a new event. Now this is going to be a step event, but an end step event. And what we need to do is we need to add ourselves a variable in. In this variable we type h speed, which is short for horizontal speed. We then have 0 and we write larger than. We click OK. Now if the horizontal speed is larger than 0, we want it to change into the sprite of the arrow that's facing the right direction. So we choose our sprite, which is just sprite enemy, and we have it on sub image 0 and a speed of 1. Now the next thing that we need to do is we then need to have an else rule. And what that means is if the horizontal speed is 0, so when it turns around, then that's when it swaps to the other sprite. So we go back into our control, we need to find our else rule, which is this one here under the other, and put that in. We then need to copy this command, so we Control C, Control V, and move it below the else. We need to change this into enemy left. So if the horizontal speed stops, which is what happens when it hits the block, it will change it into the other sprite. All you need to do then is just click on OK, press play on your game, and we'll see what happens. And as you can see, that enemy, as it moves across invisibly, switches sides every time it hits the block. So that's the end of this tutorial. But remember that you can also apply this idea to your main object. So if you've got a character that's in a platform game or a maze game that moves around, it looks more realistic if he's facing the direction he's heading, so he's not just walking backwards all the time. So you need to set it up something similar to what we've done here, but rather than have end step, when you have your left and right commands for your walking to the left with your keyboard and your right, you need to use the change sprite command to make it look like he is facing the other direction. So save your work and keep going.